You're listening to a CNA podcast.
We often talk about preventing climate change, slowing it down, or adapting to a changing world. What if we could reverse some of the harm that's been inflicted on the planet? It's part of the promise of companies working on carbon capture. Today, we're looking at an industry with a lot of hype and plenty of critics. Hi, and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Jack Ward. Hello, Li-Ling Tan. Distance between us this week.
That's right, Jack. After a rare opportunity a week ago to actually record an episode together in person right here in Singapore, you are now back in Bangkok. We need to get you back here soon, again.
Back home in the heat, in the monsoon, and experiencing power cuts all morning. So,
Right.
Thankfully, the air conditioning is back now, so I'm chill. I'm ready to go. You ready?
Born ready.
Okay. Now, of all the people I know, I think you might be right up there when it comes to being suspicious, being distrustful about new technology. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair to say.
Okay. So carbon capture, this will be an interesting one for you, I think. There are many nuances to this technology. There's different methods, there's different processes, different uses. In short, it's basically like trapping and grabbing pollution from the air before it's being released into the atmosphere, like bubbles before they fly away, and then often sending it down deep into the earth. Now, I also have a pretty healthy level of skepticism around this. There are many experts who are also vehemently against relying on something largely unproven at scale. But I can also see the absolute need for new answers if the world is actually going to stay livable. Before we really get into it, your early thoughts about carbon capture?
Well, like you, I do agree that technology is critical in so many ways. I mean, it helps to educate, collect data, automate, solve problems, and overcome challenges, right? The problem, though, is that in fighting climate change or adapting to its effects, much of the tech that we have today that's being looked into require just too much energy, like AI, for example. And then there are others that still rely a lot on fossil fuels, like electric vehicles. And many of them take the focus away from mitigation efforts to roll back on emissions. And I am basically suspicious of technology as a panacea.
Okay, I think we'll have an interesting discussion today to address some of your concerns, which are definitely valid, I think, in this case. All right, quiz time, a bit of fun to start us out. Today, we are going to be talking a lot about what's called hard-to-abate emissions. Now, these are those pesky, but not just pesky, downright damaging pollutants from various industries that the world relies upon, but where there's actually no real clear alternative to the industrial processes that they use. Now, these make up about 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So basically a third of all of our efforts we haven't really found a way of dealing with. I want to know which industry is the biggest contributor to those greenhouse gas emissions. Is it transport, chemicals, steel, or cement?
Transport, chemicals, steel, or cement. Okay, I think I know where two of these go in the lineup, but I'll need to weigh the other two.
Okay, answers will be at the end. Okie dokie. News time, Li-Ling. What's happening in the climate world this week?
All right, first up. Climate change is killing our buildings in slow motion. And that's...
killing something else.
Yeah, that's right. Doom and gloom brought to you by Li-Ling Tan. Now, so basically, that was the attention-grabbing headline from a Bloomberg article recently. And it's not just because of storms and floods, like we talked about in our last episode on sinking cities. It really is the extreme temperature swings as well, the severe heat and the drought. And this Bloomberg article pointed out how high temperatures can degrade buildings, melt things like sealants, and cause structures to expand and foundations to shift.
And they're not just talking about heat, right? although temperature swings can cause like cracks and water to seep into the structure and undermine the safety of these buildings as well, right?
That's right. And infrastructure too. And it's come to the point where, a lot of these developments that were built to withstand a certain type of climate are now coping with another one. And as cities try to adapt to this increasing pressure and the more prolonged and frequent climate changes, is going to be more costly for everyone.
I mean, spending time in the Middle East covering COP last year, you can really see in the middle of the desert, these extremely large, modern glass buildings. I was always wondering, what impact does having desert storms and 50-degree heat have on those buildings? And obviously, it's clear that they're being degraded. And as those temperatures increase, more strain on the buildings that we need. What else?
So I found this really quite interesting story about how weathercasters could be the next climate superheroes.
What about podcasters about weather?
I think climate podcasts might come in a close second, perhaps. Now, newsrooms around the world are increasingly covering a lot of cyclones, hurricanes, and floods, and this is likely to keep continuing and even getting worse, right? So an article by The Guardian points out how storms like the recent hurricanes in the U.S. May have affected polling for the presidential election, and that many viewers turn to weathercasters on local telly for live weather and storm updates. I don't know how much of that actually happens here within our region, about how much people turn to the weathercasters to anticipate or prepare for these extreme weather events, but it's an interesting observation. And the article also pointed out that meteorologists are among the most trusted sources, even as trust in the news media is tanking.
Interesting. Do we even have a weather segment on CNA News?
I don't think so. I think it's time to start.
I think we need to bring the experts in. Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's jump into our main story this week. How to get rid of carbon dioxide? It's a really tough question. There are lots of ways that we as a civilization are cutting down on producing it. We're using electric vehicles. We're using solar panels, for example. But in our material world, where so much of what we create and build still needs processes that create emissions. Carbon dioxide is responsible for 76% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and it contributes to about 2/3 of total heating influence on the planet's atmosphere. It's making us cook, and it's bad. So the potential of being able to lock away harmful emissions is exciting. And that's also lucrative for companies that can prove that carbon capture works. Now, this technology does seem like something from the future or science fiction, but it's being developed right around the world. And scientists now actually concede that it's inevitable, that carbon removal will need to be among the suite of options to limit global warming, that it's unavoidable.
But there are risks and downsides, right? Currently, many of these carbon capture technologies are largely untried. They're not commercialized yet, and they remain highly expensive. Now, experts have warned that deploying such technology cannot come at the expense of rapid decarbonization and the transition away from fossil fuels altogether. In reality, though, it may be doing just that. And they say the cost of choosing carbon capture instead of financing clean technology could be extreme, at a staggering $30 trillion more expensive by one estimate.
And not all carbon capture projects were born equal. They have different applications and they're being used by different industries. Some of the technology can be retrofitted, for example, to existing power and industrial plants, allowing for their continued operation, which may be fine for some processes that we need, like steel or concrete. But what if that's a coal plant?
So what you're saying is that instead of the winding down of the oil, gas, and coal sectors, they all could live on, supported by carbon capture. And which brings me back to my point earlier, right? The fear and the criticism is that these untried, unscaled, and unviable technological solutions could then become a pillar on which polluting industries now lean upon, instead of looking to phase out fossil fuels, for example. And that, in turn, Jack, would slow the green transition. So that's why I'm suspicious.
It would. But there are pros and cons. We need this, but don't rely on it too much. It could help, but it's expensive. We need to fund it, but what if it doesn't actually work like it's meant to? Now, Climeworks is a Swiss company and a world leader in direct air capture technology. Their focus is to withdraw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and bury it underground. In the windy, volcanic plains of Iceland is where the company is test bedding what it believes will be a major weapon in the fight against climate change. I sat down with its CEO, Christoph Gebald, to discuss all of these issues. Christoph Gebald, welcome to Climate Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
One of your ambitions, in your company's own words, is to reverse climate change. It goes beyond this normal terminology that we hear in climate circles around mitigation, adaptation. Is reversal actually possible?
You know, when my co-founder and I set out 15 years ago to start the company, the very fundamental idea we had is sort of to create a climate utility or a sewage plant for the atmosphere, right? Mm-hmm. Like today, it's normal that we're treating water, we're treating our waste, but we're not treating the atmosphere, and we're dumping a lot of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, in comparison to, for example, a plastic bottle, we can't see CO2, we can't smell CO2, right? It's an invisible gas. Now imagine if CO2 was black or brown or whatever, if you could see it, right? And if you put the CO2 that humanity emitted to date since the Industrial Revolution in a layer over the surface area of the planet, it would be a layer of 2.5 meters. So there's hardly any person on Earth who could see through that layer, right?
We wouldn't stand for it, right?
Yeah, and that is the very fundamental thought we had, Jan and I, when we started the company 15 years ago. We said, hey, listen, it's accumulating, and we have to reverse it. We have to get it back out of the air, else it'll be unhealthy. And today, 15 years later, this is confirmed by climate science. Mm-hmm. There's no way that we can achieve climate target and avoid catastrophic climate change if we're not taking back CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Talk us through then direct air capture. How does it work? How has it changed? Have you been surprised by what you've been able to harness over the journey of Climeworks?
Well, how does direct air capture work? Think of it as boxes, 40-foot shipping containers. Each of us has seen one, like a big truck trailer or the containers on big container ships. Those are the standard modules we're taking. So those are the standard unit sizes, if you want. Each of those collectors has a couple of ventilators, and what we do is we turn on ventilators and pull air through those, as we call them, CO2 collectors. And inside is where the magic happens. Inside we have a filter material. This is like a solid granule, maybe size of sand, which is very porous. And inside the pores of the material, the CO2 gets stuck, if you want, right? If you stream air through it, the CO2 gets stuck and all the other parts of the air simply pass through it. And after a certain time, like all parking lots for the CO2 are occupied, and then we can again remove the CO2 from the system by heating it to the boiling point of water. And then by that we extract pure CO2 out of the system, and we can subsequently pump it into the ground in order to store it there and remove it from the global carbon cycle. This is very fundamentally how it works. Now, what have been our observations? Our observations have been when we develop the technology in the laboratories, it's sort of simple, right? You take this type of porous sand, you stream air, you have less CO2 at the outlet, and you're excited. You're like, wow.
We did it.
Yeah.
We solved the problem of the world.
We can address the biggest challenge of humanity in a really easy way. Now, then you're building a plant in the outdoors, like a commercial plant, and that's what we did as actually the first company globally in 2017, 7 years ago. And what you figure out is that what you learn in the lab is only partially to be translated to the real world applications. But with all of this experience over the last 7 years, we have been able to improve the technology and have celebrated a couple of breakthroughs. Just this year, we announced a breakthrough that by further optimizing the system, we were able to double the amount of CO2 we get through the boxes. We were able to halve the energy consumption of the boxes. So my observation over the last 15 years is for this technology, where it sounds very simple, it's really hard to do it reliably outdoors in an environment with rain, with sand, snow, dust, whatever you have, storms. But, we've been doing that now since 7 years in real outdoor environment. And based on that, we are continuously improving and getting the cost down.
So your growth as a company has been significant over the 15 years that you mentioned. From a tiny startup, I guess, and to what you have now. What's more challenging, getting from there to now, or getting from where we are now to where you need to be in the future?
When we started the company 15 years ago, there was no scientific consensus around what we did, right? There was, at that time in 2009, science did not recommend to capture CO2 from the air and store it in the ground. It was rather, again, the engineering logic of my co-founder and I saying, hey, to us, right? It sounds totally logic that we have to do that. But given that the broad science base was not behind what we did, it was sort of some headwind, if you can imagine, right? It's like it was, at that time, I would say 9 out of 10 people said, you're absolutely crazy and what you're doing is not needed. And today it's different. Today we have broad scientific consensus on what we need, but we have other challenges, right? Today, fundamental challenges. The big questions are, what is the cost of the technology? Can you bring the cost down? Can you create the returns that investors need? So it's different challenges, both of which have been like very demanding at the respective times. But listen, like I love challenges. This gives me a lot of power and energy, and else we wouldn't be doing that.
Obviously, CO2 capture is still controversial to a degree. Can you explain sort of the obstacles that you've faced from people who philosophically don't believe in this concept?
Well, the biggest obstacle, one is economics. Sometimes people say it's too costly. And, costly is not an absolute thing. It's a relative thing. So what's important when talking about cost is to offer the right comparisons, right? And, when you go back to early clean technologies like photovoltaics, early 2000s, where my home country, Germany, was one of the pioneers with feed-in tariffs. And when they launched feed-in tariffs in 2000, if you calculate what Germany paid per ton of CO2 avoided, it was somewhere in the range above 700 euros per ton on a massive scale, right? Billions of euros per annum. And that are actually programs that are still running today. And those programs then also existed in Japan, in Spain, in California, and other parts of the world. If we look at battery electric vehicles today, you get tax subsidies or tax reductions, right? If you, again, calculate the emissions saved of an electric vehicle to an internal combustion engine and compare it to the tax credit you're getting, you're again talking something like $1,000 per ton of CO2 avoided, right? Now, in such with the cost that our technology, first of a kind, early day has today, we're in very good company with the cost that you're seeing there. And with the technology being a modular technology like photovoltaics, for example, and offering mass production, the cost will come down. Another critic that sometimes is discussed in the public domain is a thing called the moral hazard, or whether our industry is sort of a fig leaf to the traditional energy industry to simply continue to do what they have been doing. And in my point of view, this argument is nonsense or does not exist. Why? CO2 reduction efforts are more economical than what we do. Like getting CO2 back out of the air is the last resort. This you want to do for stuff that you can't avoid otherwise. Hard to abate emissions, unavoidable emissions, right? Now, if you assigned what we did to stuff that could be replaced by clean technology easily, you're simply overpaying. So economically, this argument, in my point of view, is not existing.
It's a necessary complement to what other transitions are occurring. But, I mean, there are so many industries, right, where the processes to switch to a clean system is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine you have an electric car in front of you, right? It's like the image of clean. And imagine you have a wind turbine next to the electric car, powering the electric car. What a beautiful picture. And it gives you the impression of 0 grams of CO2 per mile or kilometer traveled. But it's not the case because, the car has some gray emissions, like through building the car, the battery, the steel in there, and the wind turbine has as well. And this is the unavoidable part. And that is exactly what the thinking today is, that the electric car allows you very substantial emission reductions in comparison to like the fossil equivalent, like an internal combustion engine. But there's some remaining parts, say 5 to 10% remain. And those 5 to 10% are the role of our company and others to be removed. Reduction and removal together will yield net zero.
Obviously, this solution has to be a global one for it to work. Talk to me about Asia as a region for opportunity for carbon capture. What needs to happen here or change here for that to expand?
The 2 ingredients that we need to capture CO2, low carbon, low cost energy, and a place to store CO2 in the ground. And there are excellent places to do that in Asia. For example, Indonesia is an interesting example, also having geothermal renewable energy sources like in Iceland. Malaysia has underground storage potential. Japan is a really interesting place because of policy. Japan is very progressive on direct air capture policy. They have been recommending to include carbon removal credits in their local cap and trade system under the condition that 20% of a project has Japanese investment in it.
Okay.
That's a very progressive, very good policy for us. So we do see that the region or Asia offers like everything that is needed in order to move forward. Going back 2 years ago, we raised a substantial fundraising round, the biggest in our domain, $650 million US, and that has been co-led by the Government Investment Corporation of Singapore, which is a very, very renowned investor sharing the same long-term view on this topic as we have.
In a broader sense, how do you think the world right now is dealing with the challenge of climate change?
Well, at the moment, there's, I would say, some distraction from the topic of climate change. So I think the challenge we currently have as humans is that there are so many other things popping up that like urgent, that maybe we don't have the focus on the topic globally that we need. Because on the other side, it's really urgent to act, right? If we look at 2023, global average temperature was 1.48 degrees above pre-industrial, which is like the warmest year on record. It's presumably the warmest year since the last 100,000 years. Actually, scientists have a hard time explaining what's going on. And, maybe we are at a point where we're seeing first serious warning signals that we might be leaving a stable state that we had in the last 20,000 years when you and I developed, so to say. It's a very challenging environment because of the own-made conflicts that we're having. And on the other hand, we have this massive challenge, which I do think is maybe a bit underestimated in the context of the consequences it'll have on us.
Okay, quiz time, Li Ling. To repeat the question, which hard-to-abate industry is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions? Is it transport, chemicals, steel, or cement? All things that we do need, but we struggle to clean up.
Okay, so I know transport gets a lot of heat. But I think in the grand scheme of things, though, transport only accounts for a fraction. What was it, Jack? How many percent? Do you remember? I don't remember. Okay, but
I'm
it's
not revealing any of the numbers.
So transport, and you'll reveal later, but transport accounts for a smaller fraction of it than some of the other industries that we depend on quite significantly. I think the worst culprit is the steel sector. It generates a lot of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. I think, if I'm not wrong, it is the biggest culprit. Now, I know chemicals and cement come after, in between that. I'm just not very clear which one is which. So I'm just going to toss a coin and go with cement and then chemicals. So steel, cement, chemicals, and transport.
Okay. Interesting that you went for a ranking. I was only asking for the worst. But
Pavlov.
You are used to having to put things in order.
Pavlov's dogs right now. Yeah, so used to it by this point.
The worst is actually chemicals.
Really?
So that includes the production of plastics and various other chemicals. The processes often release CO2 as a byproduct, which are hard to replace or change without new technology.
Chemicals.
Coming in after that, cement and steel are similar, around 7 and 9% each. Yeah, and transport is the least worst of those.
The least worst.
Okay, that's it for this episode of Climate Conversations. Thanks as always for joining us. Of course, we'll be back here next week.
And that's when we'll be giving you the lowdown on what's coming up at this year's COP29 Climate Summit in Baku, Azerbaijan. I'm Li-Ling Tan.
And I'm Jack Board. Thanks as always to the team that put together this podcast, Sai Ye Win, Tiffany Ang, Janani Johari, and Crispina Robert.